thank you. First, thanks for the invitation. It's great to be in this workshop. I started studying timbre with Steve Lacklands more than 15 years ago. I've done my PhD with him. I can see here there's a lot of other PhD students from Steve, so it's kind of a family reunion. Very nice. I've been working those last 6-7 years on cochlear implant, and what I'm going to talk to you about is how people perceive timbre with a cochlear implant. So, as all of you might not be totally familiar with that device, I will briefly introduce it. For those of you who know it, bear with me just a moment. So the cochlear implant is a medical implanted device that allows people that are severely deaf, that could not benefit from a hearing aid, to hear again, and especially to be able to understand speech in quiet situations. It's composed mainly of 3 parts. The sound processor, the external part here, that will collect the sound, process it, and then it will send the information through a transcutaneous RF link to the receiver that is placed between the temporal bones and the skin. So the two of them, oh, the color is terrible. The two of them will communicate through this link here, and you have a magnet in the middle to keep them aligned. The receiver will process further the information in order to create biphasic electric pulses that we send in one of these electrodes. This electrode array here is placed within the scala tympani. It spans the first turn of the scala tympani. Therefore, each electrode will activate a different region of auditory nerves. When the most apical electrode will be activated, it will create a sensation that can be categorized as low. And when the electrode closer to the base will be activated, it will generate a sensation that will be categorized as high. So this device works very well, especially for speech in quiet. People that used to be deaf could not hear anything can get about 80% of the speech signal. However, the device has some limitation. It's not so good for music perception and speech in notes. There's a lot of different problems in music, and what I will concentrate is why we all hear timbre, because they cannot perceive timbre very well. So when we talk about when we want to study timbre in cochlear implant listener, the first question we might ask is, how do they perceive the timbre of a musical instrument? So the good thing is that we can base our research on many previous studies that developed some very efficient tools to study timbre. I'm going to talk about one of them by Steve that was done in '95. I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with that. But basically, they ask 98 normal hearing listeners to just rate the dissimilarity between 18 synthetic sound matched in loudness and pitch. Each of these sounds was created based on the synthetic instrument. Based on those data, they were able to create a 3-dimensional space. First dimension was well correlated with the log of the attack time, the second one with the spectral centroid, and the third one with the spectral flux, or the spectral spread. So we have replicated exactly the same experiment. But instead of normal hearing listeners, we had an additional of 8 cochlear implant listeners. So we've done that both with 15 normal hearing listeners and 8 cochlear implant listeners. You can notice right away that the number of subjects is quite low, and that's always the difficulty in our field in cochlear implant research, is to find the subject. They're pretty rare. So that's why most of the study will be with a fairly low number of subjects. So we've done exactly the same task with exactly the same stimuli. We find very similar space for the normal hearing listeners, which validate kind of our approach. What is most interesting is to look at the space that was developed for the cochlear implant listeners. And we found a 2-dimensional space with the first dimension very well correlated with the log of attack time. I've showed here the scatter plot between the projection in the first dimension here and the log of attack time. And the second dimension, fairly well correlated with the spectral centroid. Here's another scatter plot between dimension 2 and the spectral centroid. We did not find a third dimension. And there's a couple reasons that we can think about. The first one is maybe they don't perceive this third dimension that normal hearing listeners perceive. But maybe the other reason is that our group of listeners was too low, with only 8 listeners, and there was a lot of variability. Maybe we didn't have the statistical power in order to derive this third dimension. So we cannot really conclude from that. Anyway, if we go back to our question, we can see that at least the 2 most salient dimensions that we can find are correlated with the log of attack time in the spectral centroid, just as the normal hearing listeners. So based on this, we might think, well, but maybe people with a cochlear implant just perceive timbre as well as normal hearing listeners. That's totally possible. So there's no problem here. So if they do that, they should be quite good in identifying or categorizing musical instruments. So in order to answer this question, we can look at another set of data that we have collected with children. We've done this experiment with 9 normal hearing listeners children and 6 cochlear implant children, aged from 9 to 12. They were seated in a classroom with a sheet of paper with the different cartoons of people playing music. And they heard sample of music of just one instrument. And they had to circle which one instrument was played. Here are the results for the normal hearing group. I've just shown you the confusion matrix. And I've divided the 12 instruments into 2 categories, the percussive and the non-percussive. So you can see for the normal hearing children that it's almost all around the diagonal. So they're very good. And it was not very hard. There's a bit of confusion between, for example, the timpani and the drum kit. So when they heard timpani, they circle the drum kits. But that's fair enough. They're the young kids. Bit of confusion also with the clarinet and the cello, which is a bit more hard to understand. We have a couple of people that get confused, the female with the flute. But that's, I think it's because they were quite having a lot of fun in the experiment and didn't really pay attention. It didn't look mean enough, I think. But anyway, bottom line, they're able to do this. Now let's have a look at the result for the cochlear implant kids. So same age, same school, same environment. Here we can see right away that there was much more mistakes. The diagonal is not so clearly defined here. You can see here there's a lot of confusion. For example, for the clarinet, only 21% accuracy score. A lot of people will confuse the clarinet, and here I think this should be the violin, which seems quite odd because they're very far away. Other point that I want to point out is male and female. When they heard a male singer, 25% of them claimed it was a female. Okay. It's just to show you that their ability to perceive pitch is quite poor. The main point that I want to make in that slide is that the most confusion is within the category. Okay. So they were quite good in saying if it was a percussive or non-percussive, but within those categories, it's kind of a big mess. So the conclusion from that experiment is that, okay, our normal hearing listening kid can do the task quite well. Our CI not so well. Most of the confusion is within the category. And such experiments have been replicated by other groups with adults, cochlear implant listeners, and find very similar results. So it's just not applied to children. So that's a bit confusing. On one side, I told you the perception of timbre seems to be fairly similar to normal hearing listeners. But then on the other side, they're very poor at being able to identify timbre instruments. So that seems like a little bit of controversy here, or the problem that we need to solve. So in order to better understand how they perceive timbre, maybe we should go a little bit deeper. Because those two experiments, we use people with a Cochlear implant and we just presented sound through loudspeakers. So the sound was in fact processed by the Cochlear implant. So I'm just going to go a little bit deeper. I'm just going to take another break and explain to you a little bit more about how the sound is processed within the Cochlear implant and what parameters can we use in order to induce different types of sensation. So as I said before, the Cochlear implant is made of different electrodes, so you can stimulate with whatever electrodes you want. And each electrode will create a pulse. It can be a pulse rate or a modulated pulse rate. So here is what I call, not just me, everyone's called that, the cochleogram. Okay? So on that axis you have the time, and here you have the channel, the number of electrodes that have been stimulated. And each bar here will represent an electrical pulse. So in that case, we have stimulated 3 electrodes at the same time. And that can represent a valve, for example. The electrode 22 is the one that is inserted the deeply inserted, so it's going to give you this low sensation. So if you want to create a low sensation, you're going to activate just one electrode at the apex. If you want to create a higher sensation, you're going to activate an electrode near the base. You can also play with the pulse rate. Okay? You can increase the pulse rate or slower the pulse rate. Typically, this is not done in most of the commercial devices, but when you're doing the experiment, you're able to do that. When you increase the pulse rate, also your sensation an increase of pulse rate will give you a sensation that will be categorized as higher. So the pulse rate is our second parameter. What we can do is we can also modulate each of these pulse rates. It doesn't have to be flat. So here, the height of the bar will correspond to the amount of current we're going to put. So in that case, we have a current that will fluctuate, will be modulated. And we can vary the frequency of this modulation in order to induce different sensation. So if we go back to what is psychoacoustics. Psychoacoustic is the field where you can try to relate different sensation, auditory sensation, loudness, pitch, brightness, into some physical descriptor, intensity, duration, and so on. Steve, again, sorry if I mention you all the time, liked it to describe to have invented psychomechanics. What I'm going to present today is psychoelectric. So it will be the field where you try to relate the perception with different electrical parameters that you can change within the Cochlear implant. So the current intensity, when you're going to increase the current intensity, it's going to increase the loudness. That's pretty clear. The duration of your burst will increase also your perceptual duration. I took out localization because here I'm going to talk about just with one implant, so you have no localization cues. But you can vary the rate, the electrode position, the amplitude modulation, the mode of stimulation that I'm not going to talk about today. So really the question is, how do we relate each of those parameters? How do we map that? How do they influence the perceptual dimension? So to answer this question, we have a current PhD project run by Wiebke Lemke, and she replicated an old experiment by Bismarck. Basically, Bismarck presented some sound and had people rate on different scales in order to describe the timbre or the sound quality of each of these sounds. And she's done the same thing with Cochlear implant listeners and with different stimuli. One of them was just a pulse strength, so pulses with the same amplitude at different electrode plates and different rates. In the other set, she used the same 4 electrodes, but she used a higher carrier rate and she imposed an amplitude modulation at different frequencies. And she just asked people to describe those sounds. So if we look at the result for the first set with the pulse rate, So we have here, I think it's missing color. We have here the result for the pitch height. So people were asked to rate on the scale from low to high. Those different sounds. And you can see here, so this is the result for the 4 different electrodes positions at different rates. So the square here would be the electrode 10, and the circle here would be electrode 22. So you can see that when we increase the rate, people will judge it as higher, and that makes sense. But also when we increase the electrode position from 10, which is 22, here. So from electrode, 10, which is most at the base, people will report that as higher than when we stimulate electrode 22, which is more at the apex. Also makes sense. What is interesting is to see that there's this 300 Hertz mark where it starts to plateau for the rate. So this result is nice, but it has been shown already previously quite often in the literature. What was more interesting in her study is that she used exactly the same stimuli, but she tried different attributes, like brightness and roughness. And you can see here for the brightness that the pulse rate will also have a big influence on the brightness. But also the electrode place will have a kind of big influence on the brightness only when the pulse rate is fairly high, up to 600 pulse per second. Before that, below 300 Hertz, the place will not have that big influence on the brightness. Roughness, another big attribute, will also be quite affected by those 2 parameters. You can see that the roughness will be, we can see that roughness will decrease with the pulse rate. We find similar type of result with the amplitude modulation. However, here we're going up to 400 in that, because we were limited by the Nyquist frequency. So to try to put some arrow in that map, we can see that the rate will influence the pitch, the brightness, and the roughness. Same as the electric position, same as the amplitude modulation. So it's kind of a big mess. That's why it's so hard to study Cochlear implant. So we found, but at the same time, you might argue, well, you use some very simple stimuli, some pulse train. If you do the same experiment with normal hearing listeners and just have them rate a pure tone and ask them to see how bright it is, yeah, the frequency might have some effect on the brightness. So maybe this is just due because we use some fairly simple stimuli. So which brings us to the question, when you're going to present a pulse train on just one single electrode, how are they going to perceive that? Are they going to perceive that as a pure tone, a narrowband noise? We don't really know. And that's what we try to figure out in this experiment. So in this experiment, we had 9 listeners with single-sided deafness. So it means that they had one cochlear implant on one side, and the other ear was normal. And we present them with some pulse train on the cochlear implant. And we give them a tool that will allow them to create some sound. We did not use your software, maybe we should have, because it was way more developed than ours. But anyway, people were able to modify the sound that they could perceive on the acoustic side in order to match the timbre of the sound that they will be sent on the cochlear implant. So basically we were alternating just a pulse train on the electrode 20 or 14, and then another burst of sound, and they could modify until they were satisfied with the match. So I'm going to make you listen to such an average match for the electrode 14. So who says it's going to sound like a pure tone? No? Narrowband noise? Anything? Any guess? We don't have time for guess. So let's listen to. Okay, so it's a sound very high pitched and also in harmony, so a very complex sound, so kind of weird timbre. For the electrode 20, it sounds more like a pure tone. Okay. So the timbre, I'm about to conclude, the timbre sounds quite different. And also, one important thing is they were able, within the experiment, they were able to change also some filter to categorize the brightness. And we found a very strong influence on the electrode position and the brightness of the sound, which allows to draw that time. So this is my last slide, and say that, well, what do a Cochlear implant sound like in single electrode? It will sound like a single pulse strain with inharmonic sound. So that's why it's quite hard to recreate music perception with that. Thank you.
Questions?
I have a question. Thank you for talking about that. It's really interesting. A question about the first study with the one with the children.
Yes.
What was the age of the children?
No, between 9 and 12.
Okay. And the ones with cochlear implants, how long have they had cochlear implants?
So usually when you have children 9 to 12, it means that they've been implanted at birth.
Okay. So yeah. So that was slightly. I wondered if there's a difference in.
There's what's interesting in healthcare right now is that children were started to be implanted in birth maybe 20 years ago. So we start to have the first adults that have all their life with cochlear implant. Yeah.
I was wondering, well, actually two questions building onto each other. One is, how much more variability was there in the cochlear implant participants as opposed to the normal ones? Could that be due to how these are implanted? Because I imagine you can't always get the electrodes at the right frequencies necessarily from.
So that's also the big challenge in our field is that the variability is huge in cochlear implant. And yes, there's the fact that you can insert the electrode slightly different ways, but it's more, especially when you look at adults, there's a big difference, influence of the duration of deafness. The longer your deaf, basically, the more your auditory nerves will die. So that's why you have a lot of variation. So if you implant someone rather fairly early on, the auditory nerve will be quite good, and maybe the implant will have a better result. But overall, we cannot really control that because we don't have a lot of subjects yet. So we have to take a lot of different patients with different duration of deafness, and that will lead to a lot of variability in our data.
Thank you very much. I have a question about the using terms like brightness and roughness with cochlear implant participants. How perceptually relevant were actually these terms?
That's a great question. I think that's one of the problems with this field of research. Just keeping on learning a problem, so no one's going to do cochlear research after that. But yes, when you study human perception, you kind of rely on your own sensation. Well, here they will perceive something totally different. So what people have been doing before is just they ask them to rate stuff on their scale from low to high, and they were able to do that. So they say, oh, if they're able to rate the scale, something on the scale from low to high, it must be pitch. So therefore, they associated the electrode place with pitch. What I'm trying to convey is that no, maybe it's not pitch. If you just give them one scale from low to high, they'll be able to place that. But what they perceive might be quite different from what we perceive. And that's why we had this approach where we said, we're going to give them a lot of attributes, and we're going to see which one makes sense for them. So I'll just present 3 of them, but in the original study we had 15 different, but it was more, a lot of them were redundant, and we've done a PCA, and those 3 were the ones that kind of categorize or represent all the data.
Can you go back to your vision matrices?
Yes.
I'm actually not as negative about those results as you are.
Well, I said a lot of nice things about you.
So, I only
Yeah, but so you're partly right. But I think the result, the fact that you have a lot of fuzz, you have to. So in this task, you only had. It was a closed set of 12 instruments, and it was not single note. It was like 10 seconds of music played by one instrument. So you have a lot of cues. So was that? If you do that with adults, you get 100%. It's a very easy task. So to have such a fuzz with this easy task, I think tell us something about the ability to do it.
We could take one last question.
Yes, over here. Actually, good slide for my question. This may be just, like you mentioned, an artifact of just having just this one sample of subjects, and I fully understand the difficulty. There seemed to be a deficit in recognizing male voices from female voices in this sample.
Yes.
That they will confuse more male for females. Is this something which is known in the adult cochlear implant population? Is this a known effect?
So yes, especially when you start to be implanted. So the implant will be located within the first turn of the skeleton. So basically, it's hard for them to get lower sound, lower sensation. And especially when you have an adult that is implanted for the activation, the first thing that they're going to tell you is, oh, you sound like a chipmunk. So everything sounds quite high. And even for an adult, it would be hard to distinguish male and female. But with training, they might differentiate that. And also a little bit with there's brain plasticity that can be involved and to regain a little bit of low frequency. But it's usually the case that they don't perceive well these low frequencies. I mean sound as low as we.
All right, well, thank you. Want to keep going?
We could allow one more question. I
Okay,
think.
that's fine.
Just, it's also a question in this slide. So the children that were deaf from both sides.
Yes.
Do you think you would get different results if you have children or I know that at some point have normal or hearing and then being deaf for some reason? So maybe they can, learn some cues with normal hearing, and when they do that, maybe they'll be able to pick those subtle cues.
So there was some study that was done with adults. And when you do study with adults, it's often the case that they have hearing during all their life. In most of the case, adults will lose their hearing in their 40s, 50s, and have the cochlear implant in 60s. That's typical the case, and they find the same result. So I think it's more like the inability to hear subtle cues, subtle tempo